Darwin's finches, the Gouldian finch and the jackaroo, or grassquits in general, how they linked. Now, someone might have the answer before I even start, I don't need to give you the talk. Does anybody want to tell me what the link is between these three birds, or groups? That's good, I'll give you a talk then. Sorry?
The same shape of beak.
Yeah, well, they're all broadly finches. They all broadly feed on seeds. They've all got simple shaped beaks. There's lots of other things that have beaks like that. So let's talk about the birds. And I guess the stimulation for this talk started a couple of years ago when Cheryl and I were lucky enough to go to Galapagos. If you ever get a chance to go to Galapagos, do it. It's just fascinating. So obviously they occur in different places. Darwin's finches only occur on the Galapagos Islands, nowhere else. Gouldian, of course, only in Australia. The jackaroo and other grassquits are Central and South American species. And I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of information about the Galapagos. Is there anyone here who's been to the Galapagos? Yeah. A visit to the Galapagos, if you're a biologist, like I am, is a real pilgrimage, because the Galapagos was where Charles Darwin collected a lot of the information and insights that helped him formulate his understanding of natural selection as the driving force for evolution. It's a key location that he visited on the voyage of the Beagle. Of course, the Beagle came to Australia as well, lots of places in South America, but the Galapagos is famous for Darwin's time there. He only visited 4 of the islands during his time there. He was only there for 5 weeks, so it wasn't very long, but it was very influential. And the observations, as I said, really helped him clarify his thinking. But it's interesting, as I'll explain, he didn't start to clarify that thinking until well after he was on the Galapagos. In fact, most of what he saw there that stimulated his thoughts about evolution were based on the tortoises and the mockingbirds, not the finches at all, as I say there. And the thought that started to formulate was, at the time, species were thought to be immutable. Species never change. Species had been as they appear today forever. And he started to, with what he was seeing, he was undermining that stability of species idea. So the Galapagos itself, there's 18 main islands and lots of small islands. They're part of Ecuador in South America. They're about 1,000 kilometres west of South America, very isolated in the Pacific Ocean. You can see here, and they lie right on the equator. So this will just show you some of the wildlife of the Galapagos. There's lots of seabirds there. So as I'll show in a moment, very few land birds. equator, the Galapagos Islands. Half of it is quite wet. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of what the Galapagos itself is like and some of the wildlife. Okay. And some of the wildlife. But you would have noticed that it is pretty inhospitable landscape in many areas. So this is on one of those volcanoes in Isabella. That's the sort of landscape. Wild cactus, many areas it's very dry and inhospitable. But if you look at the bird fauna on the Galapagos, it's really very depauperate. There are only 60 species resident, so it's a very isolated group of islands. It's pretty hard for birds to get there and colonise and stay there. And there are 26 land birds only out of 60, but half of those are Darwin's finches, 13 Darwin's finches. And this is them here, and I know you won't be able to read it up the back, but quite a diverse group of species. So there's actually 14 birds in here. The Galapagos Island finch is found only on the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific, so it's included there. So there are essentially 6 species of ground finches and the cactus finch. This is the cactus finch, and so they range from the vegetarian finch, the small ground finch, medium ground finch, large ground finch, the large cactus finch, and the cactus finch are in the genus Geospiza. Then there's all the tree finches, Camaricus, and the mangrove finch, this one, the woodpecker finch here, which I'll show you later, is the only finch there that uses tools. And then you've got the warbler finch. So it's one of the finches, but it's evolved a beak very like a warbler, and it feeds very like a warbler. Darwin's finches were the very earliest bird to land bird to colonise the Galapagos. The data suggests, the evolutionary data and DNA analysis suggests they probably arrived there between 3 and 4 million years ago, the earliest ancestor, as a single ancestor. Obviously it had to be a pair of them, but a small number of birds arrived in the Galapagos and then radiated into all of these species, driven by a lot of evolutionary forces in what is a very harsh environment. For a long time, the taxonomy of Darwin's finches was unclear. They were included in the buntings in New World sparrows for quite a while, the Emperorizidae. They've now been reclassified as Thorpids, the Thorpidae, or the tanager family, but there's still questions about that. They're not related to the true finches, the Fringillis, at all. And again, you won't be able to see all the detail here, but the key driving force that's led to this radiation is food supply and the requirement to specialise to ensure that each species has a food niche or access to food that allows it to survive and do so better than any other species. So it's food availability and specialisation that's driven the evolution of this vast differences in beak, size and morphology. And driven it because at times food is really scarce. So if you've got a specialisation that gives you a little advantage over other species on a certain food type, then you'll survive and they'll struggle. And so species have been forced to specialise. There is a broad divergence between the ground finches, these ones which largely feed on seeds and fruits, or the cactus finch, as we'll see, that feeds on cactus pollen, cactus seeds, and specialises there. And then these species, the tree finches and the woodpecker finch, the mangrove finch, that largely feed on insects. And so their beaks have evolved in different ways, driven by different things. But the variation and the divergence you see here is driven by dietary specialisation at times when food is really rare. And if we look at just these 4 species, the small ground finch, medium ground finch, large ground finch and the cactus finch, you can see here those 4 species and the different types of foods that they feed on. So the large ground finch is able to eat larger seeds that no other species can consume. They can't crack or deal with these. The small ground finch is able to find and feed on and specialise on tiny things, and the medium ground finch struggles along in the middle. When food is really abundant, all of these species will feed on a much wider array of things. But when food is scarce, their specialisations allow each of them to survive. And the cactus finch, as you can see, is very specialised, has a very unusual bill, and only feeds on cactus. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So dietary specialisation has driven this radiation. And it's the end result of a very complex evolutionary process, starting with that one ancestral species. So 4 steps involved, and again, you probably can't read that very well, but firstly, some subpopulations on those different islands becoming geographically isolated at times when there wasn't much movement between them, and over time becoming at least partially reproductively isolated. So over time they couldn't successfully reproduce with one another. And then recolonisation of islands, as some islands got closer to others, allowing those birds to come back into what's called sympatry, so they occur together. And when they occur together, then competition just further drives competition for food. I'm sorry about the red, it's really hard to see. Competition for food really drives those specialisations further. So they're the 4 steps that have led to this divergence. And Darwin, after he came back from the Galapagos, became really fascinated by this variation of what had driven it, and it became a key example that he used in The Origin of Species when he wrote it 20 years later. And it's one of the best examples you can find of adaptive radiation from a common ancestor. Now, if you go to the Galapagos, you'll see ground finches and tree finches all over the place. And I can tell you it's really hard to pick the species apart when you're a naive bird observer. But here we've got the small ground finch. These are medium ground finches. This is a large tree finch. You can see that the males go through and eclipse plumage, but when you see them in the wild, you can see tree finches on the ground, you can see ground finches in the trees. It's not easy to pick them. These are tree finches, small tree finches feeding on flowers. This is a large ground finch feeding among plants on sand behind the beach. And you see them all over the place. You find them picking something off iguanas. You find them often associated with the tortoises, and I assume catching insects or something that are flushed by the tortoises. And you even see them in the restaurants. So this is a small fish, but they become just like sparrows and use whatever environment they can find where there might be food. As I said, cactus is one of the dominant plants on many of the islands, and this is Plaza Island. You can see it's essentially lava with a few low succulents and dominated by cactus, and the cactus finch is specialised on feeding on cactus with its long bill. And you can see this is a cactus finch, this is not a cactus finch. So other finches will feed on cactus flowers when they're open. But the cactus finch is the only one that can feed on cactus flowers when they're still closed. And that gives it an advantage when, again, food is rare, it can get to a food source that the other species can't. And so that elongated bill, that you can see this one with pollen all over it, there's a specialisation for feeding on those flowers before the opening. So it's got a protected food source. But there's some other amazing adaptations among these finches. This is a species we didn't see, so these are images from Mr. Google. But this is the sharp-beaked ground finch, or so-called vampire finch, that occurs only on Wolf Island, which is a very dry, exposed island. There's very little water at all, and it's specialised to feed on blood. And it does this by pecking the backs of the gannets or boobies until they bleed, and then drinks the blood. Amazing for a finch. This is the woodpecker finch, which you can see uses tools. It uses sticks to prise grubs out of trees. It specialises in insects. You can see it here pulling them out. We didn't see the woodpecker finch either. You find them feeding on rocks by the sea. So here's one either feeding on algae or on little crustaceans. You couldn't really tell. But you can see he's got a lot of what looks like little broken up bits of shell on his bill there. And there's just a short video here. Oh yeah, that'll work. So this is a medium ground finch that's feeding on something on rocks, and you can hear how close it is to the ocean. So you can see those finches everywhere. Now these birds have been subject to lots of study. So the most famous ecologists who worked on Darwin's finches are the Grants, Peter and Rosemary Grant from Princeton. They're actually English, but were at Princeton in the US. And they did most of their work on this island called Daphne Major. And when you fly into the Galapagos, you fly into the airport at Baltra, which was built in the Second World War by the Americans. And this is Daphne Major, and this island is Daphne Minor. And as you can see them from the airport. The Grants spent 6 months of every year for 30 years living and working on that island, and they got to know every medium ground finch on that island. They rung every bird, they knew the life history of every bird, they measured every bird, and together with their students over a long period they got to collect an enormous amount of information on how that species was changing in response to food supply. And they were able to demonstrate in a 30-year period rapid evolutionary change in the morphology of beaks over a small number of generations in response to food supply. It's one of the most amazing examples of rapid change in a species. And if you want to read a great book that describes all their work, The Beak of the Finch, one of Pulitzer Prize, very readable book. I'd recommend you read it if you want. They've just put out their own book, 40 Years of Evolution, which summarises all of their work and subsequent work by their students. And this is where they used to live, 6 months every year for 30 years. So amazing stuff. And these finches, as I said, they really started to get to Darwin. One of the number of insightful statements he made about finches in the origin of species is shown here. And he really started to grasp the idea that the variation he saw originated from one species that had been taken and he says modified for different ends. So he was interpreting what he saw as evolution starting with one species. And for those of you who probably know, some of you might, Darwin would have been 200 on February 4th, 2009, and on that day, a full genome sequence of one of Darwin finches was published, the large-billed ground finch. So a full sequence of all the genes in that species. It showed there were 13,000 protein-coding genes in that genome. And importantly, 2 of those genes were shown to be developmental genes that control big morphology and size, and were subject to positive selection. So that means that they are actively being changed in response to something in the environment. If Darwin had been around to see that and understand that, he would have overlooked. Obviously he wasn't. So that's about Darwin's finches. Fascinating group of birds. Peter?
How did he know there was only one species started?
The analysis of DNA, the way you can analyse DNA these days and understand the rate at which DNA changes through random mutation, you can use the so-called genetic clock to go backwards to show you when a lineage would have started.
How did Darwin know?
Darwin didn't. But what he saw a group of species that were morphologically similar, but with divergent big morphology and dietary specialisations, and he interpreted what he saw as a radiation from one ancestor. At that time, nobody was thinking like that. That was a revolutionary thought. So he didn't know, but he looked at what he could see and he said, this is the way you could interpret this. So, I've shown you what the link is. What is the link? John link here. John Gould. So it's certainly not an evolutionary link or any relationship. The link is a personal link. So why do I put that link in there? Well, John Gould, I'm sure you all know a lot about John Gould. He was famous for producing fantastic lithographic images of birds, a lot of Australian birds. He produced many books, over 3,000 of these fantastic plates, and described many new species, particularly in Australia. He spent a lot of time in Australia with his wife Elizabeth, and you can read about there's a lot of recent books that describe a lot of what they did in Australia. He was a very successful businessman, essentially. And he was one of the early people to understand the fascination that people had with nature and that you could make money out of things like these images. So he saw an opportunity in the business of nature. The recent book is called The Business of Nature. It talks about how Gould saw the opportunity, and he was known at the time as Britain's Audubon. So Audubon was the famous American bird artist. And Gould was producing books of all these fantastic things. The interesting thing, of course, is that Gould himself didn't actually paint anything. So Gould was not the painter of any of these plates, many of which have his name on them. Most of the artwork was done by his wife Elizabeth, or by a suite of other painters, Henry Richter in particular, a German painter, Edward Lear, William Hart, and a range of others. What Gould did though, he did the early sketches of the birds, and he, in every plate, if you look at it, it includes some vegetation that is characteristic of where the birds came from. And so that was Gould's contribution. He got the stance of the bird, he did a general outline, but the actual art was done by other people. But often, if you look at some of the plates, it's got John Gould with Henry Richter. Very few have the artist's names on them. But he was a businessman. and he was very successful, and Gould had a very pivotal role in helping Darwin understand what he was seeing with those finches in Galapagos. When the beagle finally returned to England on the 4th of January 1837, or it didn't return then, but on that date, Darwin gave all his bird specimens to Gould because he was the best ornithologist at the time to study, and Darwin wasn't really interested in the finches. He thought they were different things, so he gave them to Gould. 6 days after he got them, on the 10th of January, Gould was absolutely amazed to see in those birds a series of finches so peculiar as to form an entirely new group. And he saw 13 species in those specimens, and this appeared in the newspaper. So Gould very quickly saw the significance of what Darwin brought back. And it was Gould who really convinced Darwin that he needed to look more closely at what he had here. By March, Gould had given Darwin a full report and classified all the species, other things besides the finches, and most of them were absolutely new species, had never been seen anywhere, and were only found in the Galapagos, but were clearly allied to birds of South America, which is not surprising. It's the largest, the closest continent. But Gould really was instrumental in stimulating Darwin to start thinking more seriously about finches, and he was associated with probably the most important breakthrough in modern biology, the formulation of understanding of natural selection's driving force for evolution. So that's how Gould is linked to Darwin's finches, and the Gouldian finch, of course, is linked to John Gould because he named the finch, and he named the finch after his wife. And if you get a chance to look in the handbook to the Birds of Australia, which is just a book of text, he describes on page 420 why he named it after his wife. It was dedicated to him. She travelled everywhere with him. She did many of those fantastic bits of art. Unfortunately, she died very young, and so he named Gouldian in her name, and as you know, it's, in many parts of the world, it's called the Lady Gould finch. So that's the link of the Gouldian to Darwin's finches. It's John Gould himself. So where do these fit into the picture? The Grassquits. So this is the Jacarina that we know. The other Grassquit we have is the Cuban finch. So where do they fit into the picture? Well, they are part of understanding what might that ancestral species have been that first got to the Galapagos and then radiated. And the way we explore questions like that is to understand how do you measure the relationship of species. So if you start off wanting to know what is closely related to one of Darwin's finches, and start looking at other birds, things like the gold-headed tanager. How closely related is it compared to a toucan? So how do you assemble groups of birds and understand the relationships between them? Which is the most closely related species? Well, it all comes down these days to DNA. So really using the sequence of bases in DNA, the 4 bases, and again you might remember your high school science, 4 bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. The sequence of those bases is a code, and you can use that code to compare species and ask how similar are these species, and the early technique for doing that is called nucleic acid hybridization. It's a very simple technique. You start off with DNA for 1 or 2 genes in species A, whatever it is, and you isolate the same gene or a couple of genes in species B, and you ask how similar is the sequence in those 2 genes in those 2 species. So the first thing you do is heat the DNA, which breaks these bonds, so you get a single strand. Here, and then you mix them up and then cool them. And some of these strands from species B will try to so when you cool these strands and they adhere to one another, some of them adhere the way these are, but sometimes you get a strand of mixed species. And how closely they adhere to one another. And you can see here there's a few mismatches. So the code is not identical, but the more similar they are, the more strongly they are combined with one another. And you can measure the similarity of species by this. These days, that's the early way that it was done, back in the late 80s. These days, you simply take some genes out of the mitochondria of any species, you can sequence every gene. It costs you very, very little. You can sequence a whole human these days for about $1,000. So that's how it's done these days. But this is how it was done back in the late 80s and 90s. So this is one of the earliest so-called dendrograms using DNA hybridization for most of the finch groups. And so you can see in here things like the weavers, the Australians that we all know, like our grass finches, the passerines, like the golden song sparrows, the true finches here, the cardinal lines and fingellas, like the systems. And this time in Emperor's, the cumin being an example, but the cumins are now being reclassified as tanagers. So they're now reclassified as straw. So, and you can see from this sort of a dendrogram which species are more closely related to which groups to others. So the African weavers and our Australians are very closely related, whereas they're much more distant from things like cicels, which is not surprising, and from things like Ambrosids. So this is the way you can look at the suite of species and say, well, how closely related are these species to one another? So lots of studies like that have been done with Darwin's finches, looking at a range of other species and ancestral species. And when you do that, the early studies said that, in fact, the blue-black grassquit, or the Jacarini as we know it, was the current living species that is most likely to be like the ancestral species. So that was one study that was done some time ago. Since then, it's been questioned, and in fact, it's not the blue-black grassquit. A more recent study has looked at a range of grassquits. So this is the Jacarini and the cumin that we know. This is the dull-coloured grassquit, and this is the light-coloured grassquit. So this study compared those four with Darwin's finches using the same technique. So these are all Darwin's finches here, and you can see how closely related they are to one another. Very little, like the distance in this direction is the separation we're looking at. So many of these are very, very similar, and many of them do hybridize. But the most closely related species to any of that group is the dull-coloured grassquit, which is a bit unfortunate. You'd like it to have been something with a better name. This study suggested that in fact the dull-coloured grassquit is probably of existing birds most likely that common ancestor that first colonised the Galapagos and led to these species. We don't need to worry too much about that. So we get into the end of the story. The link of the Gouldians with Darwin's finches was a personal link based on John Gould and how he interacted with Darwin and helped him understand what Darwin's finches were actually telling him. And the link of the grassquits to Darwin's finches is an evolutionary link, suggesting that they share a common ancestor. So they help us understand how those species arose. It wasn't the Jacarini though, it was another closely related species. I haven't yet been able to find any link to talk about between Gouldians and grassquits, but I'll see if I can find one. So I want to acknowledge a few people before I finish. Obviously, Charles Darwin is an inspiration for anyone who's interested in evolution and biology. Cheryl for her fantastic photos, and Jonathan Weiner is the person who wrote that book, The Finch. So if you're interested, find it and read it. It's a great read. So that's where I'll leave it, and I hope you found that interesting. Thank you. To answer any questions.
When were you over there?
2 years ago, 2013, I think it was about August.
How did you get there?
You fly there from Ecuador.
Ecuador.
Yeah.
Not sure you would do that.
No, you've got to fly to Ecuador.
Oh,
You fly out of Quito. There's a limit, like they strictly limit the number of tourists on the Galapagos at any one time. So a lot of people go there and only live on boats and visit all the islands with style boats. We stayed on some of the islands. We visited.
people on the boats can be off and they'll go.
Oh yeah. And they do lots of diving. So we visited 5 islands on boats. That's great. Other questions?
One more.
Is it the closer they are related, the more chance that a hybrid will be fertile?
Yep.
Say, for example, a citizen and a canary, are they quite close?
Yeah, the closer, or the smaller the genetic distance between the species, the more likely they'll hybridize at all, and the more likely they'll be fertile hybrids. So among, like I showed you how close Darwin's finches are themselves, there is a lot of hybridization happening now on Santa Cruz Island, where the medium ground finch and the small ground finch are hybridizing a lot, partly because humans have so changed that island. That's the only island that has many people on it, and that's the only island where there's any farming. And so there's a lot more food available than in the past, and so the species are not, like they're released from the constraint of food. And so their populations are increased and there's more hybridization going on. And on that island, the medium ground finch is potentially going to disappear because of hybridization. You're ending up with essentially a hybrid population, and the distinction between the two is disappearing. And that's evolution in action as well.
What is the distinction between species? I remember at high school it was the fact that they couldn't get breed in that first hole.
That's right.
And yet that's not what we're talking about.
Well, these species here have only been evolving for 3.5 million years. That's not long. They are very close. They're very young species. They're still developing. So, the formal definition of the species is that you can't get successful reproduction between them. These days, the way people do it is they find a genetic distance of 4%. 4% similarity or dissimilarity between these species and certain genes is a distinguishing feature. So if you've got a sequence that is 4% different to something else, then we say they're different species. But it doesn't always mean that they can't hybridize. So it's a very inexact science, particularly with young radiation like this. Okay.
Thank you very much, Gary.